The last American station wagon rolled off the assembly line in 1996. No ceremony. No farewell tour. Just a Buick Roadmaster quietly disappearing from dealer lots while Americans were already lining up to buy something taller, something that felt safer, something that felt more powerful. And here's the wild part. The thing that replaced it wasn't actually better. It was just better marketed. Think about that for a second. One of the most dominant vehicle categories in American history, a body style that once accounted for nearly 1 in every 5 cars sold in the United States, didn't die because it failed. It died because we were convinced to want something else. And the story of how that happened is one of the most fascinating, most overlooked chapters in automotive history. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about why Americans abandoned the station wagon. If you're someone who loves diving deep into the real stories behind automotive history, the cultural shifts, the business decisions, the moments where everything changed, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the collapse, we have to understand what we're actually talking about. Because when most people picture a station wagon, they picture wood paneling, an AM/FM radio, and fighting with their siblings over the rear-facing way-back seat. But the station wagon's story starts way before suburban driveways and family road trips. It starts at train stations in the early 1900s, when most Americans still traveled by rail, and a specific kind of vehicle existed for one very specific purpose: getting people and their luggage from the platform to wherever they were going next. These early vehicles were called depot hacks. Not exactly a glamorous name, but fitting. They were modified trucks with wooden benches and cargo space, basically taxis that serviced the depots. No comfort, no style, just pure utility. And honestly, that combination of passenger space and cargo capacity is exactly the DNA that would define the station wagon for the next 8 decades. Here's what most people don't realize about those early years. Ford wasn't building these vehicles. Not exactly. Starting around 1910, Ford was selling bare Model T chassis for about $700, and independent manufacturers all over the country were building their own wooden wagon bodies on top of them. In 1909, there were 551 American car manufacturers. 551. Today, we've got 3 major ones. The auto industry was essentially a cottage industry at that point, and the depot hack was right in the middle of it. The transformation from depot hack to station wagon happened somewhere between 1923 and 1929. Nobody pinpoints the exact moment, which is kind of perfect because it wasn't a single decision. It was a gradual shift in how Americans used and thought about these vehicles. By 1929, when Ford introduced the first Big 3 station wagon as a Model A variant, the name had already stuck in the public consciousness. Then in 1935, Chevrolet did something that should have changed everything. They built the first all-steel station wagon. No more wood. The problem was, people didn't want to let go of the wood. And this tells you something really important about consumer psychology that's going to come back around later in this story. People associated the wood construction with quality, with craftsmanship, with prestige. In the 1930s and early 1940s, woody station wagons actually sold at a higher price than standard cars. They weren't the bargain family hauler. They were the premium option. Ford responded in 1936 by opening their own wagon manufacturing plant in Iron Mountain, Michigan. And this wasn't some small operation. Ford literally owned forests near Lake Superior and was shipping timber down to build wooden wagon bodies that then went to assembly plants across North America. They were vertically integrated in the most literal sense possible, from the tree to the driveway. But the woody wagon had a secret that nobody in the marketing materials was going to tell you. They were an absolute nightmare to maintain. The wood required constant varnishing. You had to check for rot, make sure the joints were tight, treat it like furniture that happened to be capable of highway speeds. Imagine having to refinish your car every single year just to keep it from literally falling apart. No thank you. The breaking point came after World War II. In 1946, Willys, yes, the Jeep company, introduced the first family-sized all-steel production station wagon. They kept the painted wood grain on the sides because they understood the psychology. People still associated that look with quality, but underneath the styling, it was all steel. No rot, no varnishing, just durability. By 1949, Plymouth pushed it even further with the Suburban, a completely steel wagon that looked sharp and required zero woodworking skills to maintain. After that, real wooden wagons were gone from production. The wood that lingered was vinyl. Fake grain, real convenience. And if you think that's a little dishonest, a little cynical, hold on to that thought. Because that tension between image and reality is going to define this entire story. Now we get to what everyone remembers. The Golden Age. And to understand why station wagons exploded in the 1950s, you have to understand the America that was waiting for them. World War II ended and America exhaled. Soldiers came home. Families started growing. The government funded the interstate highway system. Developers started carving suburbs out of farmland from coast to coast. And suddenly millions of Americans had more space, more kids, more stuff, and more distance to cover than any previous generation in history. They needed a vehicle built for all of that. And the station wagon was ready. The numbers make the case better than any advertisement could. Station wagons went from less than 3% of total U.S. car production volume in 1950 to nearly 17% by the end of the decade. In 10 years, think about how staggering that growth rate is. That's not a niche product finding its audience. That's a category catching fire. And in 1958, something happened that should be remembered as a landmark moment in automotive history. The top-selling body style in the entire Plymouth lineup was the station wagon. Not the sedan, not the coupe, the wagon. What made them so dominant? Partly size. These were enormous machines. The 1968 Ford Country Squire stretched over 218 inches in length. That's more than 18 feet. For comparison, a modern Chevrolet Tahoe, which most people think of as a genuinely large vehicle, comes in around 210 inches. Your grandfather's station wagon was physically bigger than today's full-size SUV. Let that settle for a moment. But it wasn't just size. These wagons represented something larger than transportation. They were a physical manifestation of the American dream itself. The idea that you could have it all. A big family, a suburban house, weekend camping trips, and still get to work on Monday morning. One vehicle, all of it handled. The station wagon was the first true multi-purpose family vehicle, and Americans responded to that promise with their wallets. The variety was staggering. And here's where that 1976 statistic really hits. At the market's peak, Americans had 62 station wagon models to choose from. 62. Two-door wagons, four-door wagons, hardtop wagons without B-pillars, wagons with 2 rows, wagons with 3 rows, rear-facing third-row seats, side-facing jump seats. The tailgates alone were an engineering adventure. Some swung out like doors. Some dropped down like a pickup truck bed. And General Motors invented the clamshell design, where the entire tailgate disappeared into the body when opened, completely out of the way, completely clean. That's an engineering solution that most modern vehicles haven't matched. The 1960s pushed innovation even further. Buick and Oldsmobile were putting panoramic roof panels on wagons, raised roof lines with skylights that flooded the interior with natural light. The Vista Cruiser is probably the most famous example, and it was stunning, not in a restrained way. In a completely committed, over-the-top, we believe in this way that you rarely see in modern automotive design. People act like panoramic sunroofs are a recent luxury feature. Oldsmobile was doing that in 1964. The marketing matched the ambition. Ford called their premium trim the Country Squire, positioning it as though buying this wagon made you some kind of landed aristocrat. Chrysler had the Town and Country, implying the vehicle could handle both your urban commute and your weekend escape equally well. The fake wood paneling that ran along the sides, vinyl pressed to look like real grain, wasn't considered dishonest. It was aspirational. It said you'd made it. Louder and cheaper than any chrome badge could manage. And the performance during this era is genuinely underappreciated. By the late 1960s, you could order a full-size American station wagon with a big block V8 displacing 400 cubic inches or more. These were not slow vehicles. They were not sedate family appliances in any meaningful sense. You were moving 9 passengers and their luggage with an engine that in a lighter car would have been considered a performance unit. The fact that they got roughly 8 miles per gallon was irrelevant when gasoline cost 35 cents a gallon. This is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because behind the sales numbers and the optimism and the rolling land yachts, there were structural problems building quietly underneath. Here's what most people don't realize about the station wagon business in its peak years. The profit margins were actually better on sedans. Wagons required a longer frame, a bigger roof, more glass, heavier duty suspension, additional seating hardware. All of that added manufacturing cost. But you couldn't charge proportionally more for the finished product because buyers had price expectations. So the big three were making decent money on wagons, but not great money. As long as volume stayed high, the math worked. But if volume ever fell, for any reason, the whole equation flipped ugly fast. In 1970, wagon sales peaked at 972,212 units, representing 10% of total American automobile sales. That was the top. And almost nobody saw what was coming next. October 1973. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced a total oil embargo against the United States. The price of crude oil rose nearly 300%. From $3 per barrel to nearly $12 globally. But at the pump in America, the impact was even more visceral than numbers can capture. Lines at gas stations stretched around city blocks. Motorists sat in those lines for hours. Stations ran out completely. Odd even rationing went into effect based on license plate numbers. If your plate ended in an even number, you could only buy gas on even-numbered days. Now, every car was affected by the gas crisis. But station wagons were particularly exposed. A full-size wagon getting 10 to 12 miles per gallon in normal times suddenly became a financial crisis on wheels when gas quadrupled in price and supply was unreliable. The vehicle that had represented abundance and freedom now felt like a liability. The dream had an expiration date, and October 1973 was when the clock ran out. Sales collapsed. Between 1974 and 1975, full-size wagon sales dropped sharply and didn't recover. Chrysler made the first decisive move. They completely discontinued their full-size wagon lineup in 1978. One of the big three simply walked away from a vehicle category they'd been building for decades. That's not a minor adjustment. That's a verdict. And the gas crisis wasn't the only pressure. New federal emission standards introduced in 1972 required expensive engine redesigns. The big block V8s that had made these wagons genuinely exciting machines had to be detuned, reduced in compression, strangled with new emissions equipment, to meet the new standards. The result was engines that were simultaneously less powerful and less fuel efficient than what they replaced. You were paying more for worse performance and still burning fuel like a freighter. It was the worst of every world simultaneously. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because just when you might think the station wagon could find a way to survive, adapt, maybe shrink down and get efficient, a new threat appeared from an entirely unexpected direction. And it came from inside the industry itself. Lee Iacocca had taken over Chrysler in 1978 with the company on the edge of bankruptcy. He needed something revolutionary. Not a refresh, not an improvement on an existing category. Something genuinely new that would change the conversation. And in 1984, he delivered it. The Dodge Caravan and the Plymouth Voyager. The minivan. Now, you might be thinking, wait, aren't minivans just station wagons with a different name? And honestly, that's closer to the truth than Chrysler would ever admit. But the execution was different enough to matter. The minivan offered more interior volume than a wagon on a shorter overall footprint. The sliding rear doors made loading kids in tight parking lots dramatically easier than a conventional swing-out door. The seating position was higher, giving drivers better visibility. And because it was built on a car platform rather than a truck platform, it drove like a car. Responsive, comfortable, refined. But here's what really made the minivan devastating for the wagon: image. By the mid-1980s, station wagons had accumulated enormous cultural baggage. They were the vehicle of conformity, of suburban obligation, of everything that felt square and predictable about post-war American life. If you were a baby boomer who had spent childhood road trips crammed in the way back of your parents' country squire, buying that same kind of vehicle for your own family felt like surrender, like admitting you'd become your parents. The minivan was different enough to feel like a choice rather than an inheritance. It was fresh. It didn't carry the weight of every boring Saturday grocery run that a wagon did. Even though it was functionally doing exactly the same job, the perception was entirely different. And in consumer markets, perception is everything. Minivan sales grew rapidly through the mid-1980s. By 1990, Chrysler alone was selling over 600,000 minivans annually. The math was direct. Every minivan sold was a wagon sale that didn't happen. But even the minivan wasn't the knockout blow. That came from a different direction entirely. Wearing hiking boots and promising adventure nobody actually planned to have. The SUV revolution didn't start in 1984. Vehicles like the Chevrolet Suburban, the International Harvester Wagoneer, and the Ford Bronco had existed for years. But these were truck-based machines that drove like trucks, heavy, bouncy, imprecise, and requiring genuine effort to manage in daily driving. They were tools, not lifestyle products. The 1984 Jeep Cherokee changed the category's identity. It was compact enough to park in normal spaces. It had 4 doors. The ride was vastly more civilized than a body-on-frame truck, and Jeep marketed it with imagery of dirt roads, mountain trails, and open skies, selling not a vehicle, but a version of yourself. An outdoor self. An adventurous self. Even if the closest you'd come to off-road driving was a gravel driveway. Then came the Toyota 4Runner in 1984, the Nissan Pathfinder in 1986, and then the Ford Explorer in 1990. The vehicle that truly mainstreamed the SUV concept and turned it into a cultural force. By 1995, the Explorer was the best-selling SUV in America. Americans had decided, collectively and definitively, that they needed to sit up high, that they needed four-wheel drive, that the station wagon's low, practical, honest profile was no longer acceptable. Here's what most people don't realize about the economics of that shift. The profit margins on SUVs were extraordinary compared to wagons. An Explorer costs perhaps $1,000 more to manufacture than a comparable Taurus wagon. But it sold for $5,000 to $10,000 more. If you're running an automotive company with limited manufacturing capacity, and you can choose which vehicles to build, that calculation is not complicated. The market was asking for SUVs, and the financial incentives screamed to provide them. The regulatory environment made it even more distorted. CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy requirements, applied differently to trucks than to cars. Wagons were classified as cars and held to stricter fuel economy standards. SUVs, built on truck platforms, qualified under the more lenient truck standards. So a Chevrolet Suburban that got significantly worse fuel economy than a Caprice wagon faced less regulatory pressure. The rules designed to encourage efficiency were actively rewarding the least efficient outcome. It is one of the most striking examples of unintended consequences in American industrial policy. The last wagon standing were watching this happen in real time with nowhere to go. The Ford Taurus wagon soldiered on into the early 2000s. The Focus wagon disappeared by 2008. General Motors held on with the Caprice and Roadmaster until 1996, when both were quietly discontinued. No ceremony, no press release making headlines, just another casualty added to the ledger. The final years were particularly painful to watch because the quality wasn't the issue. These were competent vehicles. The Buick Roadmaster estate wagon was genuinely excellent, comfortable, spacious, reliable, with a solid V8 and more room than most modern SUVs. But by the mid-1990s, nobody wanted to be seen driving one. The stigma had won. Practicality had lost to perception, and the American station wagon was finished. The SUV revolution didn't start in 1984. Vehicles like the Chevrolet Suburban, the International Harvester Wagoneer, and the Ford Bronco had existed for years. But these were truck-based machines that drove like trucks, heavy, bouncy, imprecise, and requiring genuine effort to manage in daily driving. They were tools, not lifestyle products. The 1984 Jeep Cherokee changed the category's identity. It was compact enough to park in normal spaces. It had 4 doors. The ride was vastly more civilized than a body-on-frame truck, and Jeep marketed it with imagery of dirt roads, mountain trails, and open skies, selling not a vehicle, but a version of yourself. An outdoor self. An adventurous self. Even if the closest you'd come to off-road driving was a gravel driveway. Then came the Toyota 4Runner in 1984, the Nissan Pathfinder in 1986, and then the Ford Explorer in 1990, the vehicle that truly mainstreamed the SUV concept and turned it into a cultural force. By 1995, the Explorer was the best-selling SUV in America. Americans had decided, collectively and definitively, that they needed to sit up high, that they needed four-wheel drive, that the station wagon's low, practical, honest profile was no longer acceptable. Here's what most people don't realize about the economics of that shift. The profit margins on SUVs were extraordinary compared to wagons. An Explorer costs perhaps $1,000 more to manufacture than a comparable Taurus wagon, but it sold for $5,000 to $10,000 more. If you're running an automotive company with limited manufacturing capacity and you can choose which vehicles to build, that calculation is not complicated. The market was asking for SUVs, and the financial incentives screamed to provide them. The regulatory environment made it even more distorted. CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy requirements, applied differently to trucks than to cars. Wagons were classified as cars and held to stricter fuel economy standards. SUVs built on truck platforms qualified under the more lenient truck standards. So a Chevrolet Suburban that got significantly worse fuel economy than a Caprice wagon faced less regulatory pressure. The rules designed to encourage efficiency were actively rewarding the least efficient outcome. It is one of the most striking examples of unintended consequences in American industrial policy. The vehicles that killed the wagon, the crossovers that now dominate the American market, are station wagons. They are functionally, structurally, and practically station wagons with a 2-inch suspension lift and plastic cladding on the wheel arches. The Honda CR-V is a wagon. The Toyota RAV4 is a wagon. The Nissan Rogue is a wagon. They're built on car platforms. They have rear hatches. They seat 5 to 7 people. They carry cargo in a dedicated rear compartment behind the second row. The only meaningful difference between a 1988 Taurus wagon and a 2024 Honda CR-V is that the CR-V sits slightly higher and costs $12,000 more. Subaru figured this out before anyone else and had the intelligence to be completely transparent about it. Not to the consumer necessarily, but in their product strategy. The Outback, launched in 1994, was a legacy wagon with a lift kit, all-wheel drive as standard equipment, and styling cues that suggested outdoor capability. They didn't call it a wagon, they called it something else. Something that implied adventure and ruggedness without any of the suburban domesticity that the word wagon had accumulated. And it worked brilliantly. The Outback became one of Subaru's strongest sellers and remains so today. This is perhaps the most important lesson in this entire story. Americans didn't stop wanting station wagons. They stopped wanting to be seen driving something called a station wagon. The product was fine. The label had become a problem. There have been genuine attempts at revival, and they deserve more credit than they got from the buying public. Cadillac introduced the CTS Sport Wagon from 2010 to 2014, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the finest vehicles the brand produced in decades. The design was sharp and aggressive. The handling was legitimate sports car territory, particularly in the V-Series trim. The interior was properly luxurious. It offered everything someone might reasonably want from a premium performance vehicle, except it had a rear hatch and a usable cargo area, which apparently was disqualifying for the American luxury buyer. Sales were devastatingly low. The Cadillac CTS Sport Wagon demonstrated that even a genuinely excellent product couldn't overcome the cultural weight pressing against the wagon body style. If Cadillac, with its marketing budget, its dealer network, its brand positioning, couldn't make it work, the verdict seemed final. The Buick Regal Touareg had its own brief moment from 2018 to 2020. This was a thoughtful product, all-wheel drive standard, raised slightly to meet the crossover aesthetic expectations of modern buyers, practical cargo area, reasonable pricing. Buick genuinely tried to thread the needle between what Americans said they wanted in a crossover and what the wagon body style offered in terms of efficiency and driving dynamics. The market returned a clear answer: no. Production ended after 2 years. Now, you might be thinking, is there any scenario where this changes? Where Americans rediscover the wagon and the body style comes back in a meaningful way? And I want to give you an honest answer rather than a hopeful one. The structural obstacles are significant. First, the infrastructure of American automotive retail and marketing is entirely oriented around crossovers and SUVs. Manufacturers have invested billions in the platforms, tooling, and supply chains for these vehicles. Switching back would require not just consumer demand shifting, but enormous capital reallocation that no publicly traded company would undertake without certainty of return. Second, the regulatory picture has changed in ways that actually somewhat favor lower, more aerodynamic vehicles, which would theoretically benefit wagons. The transition to electric powertrains is exposing the inefficiency of tall, aerodynamically compromised SUVs in ways the internal combustion engine somewhat concealed. Range anxiety on electric SUVs is partly a physics problem. Tall vehicles with large frontal areas lose more energy to air resistance at highway speeds. A wagon-shaped electric vehicle is inherently more efficient, but the industry's response to this isn't to lower the ride height. It's to put bigger battery packs in the same tall vehicles. The appetite for the crossover shape is strong enough that manufacturers will work around its limitations rather than return to a more efficient form. Third, and this is the human factor that overrides engineering logic every time, most Americans have decided, somewhere in the back of their minds, that riding higher makes them safer. There's a partial truth embedded in this belief. In a collision between a tall vehicle and a low vehicle, the tall vehicle's occupants are generally better protected because the crash forces are directed differently. But this logic only works if everyone is in a tall vehicle, which is the direction we've been moving. We're in an arms race of ride height that nobody officially declared but everyone is participating in. Wagons lost that race definitively. Where there is genuine hope is in the European manufacturers who have continued bringing wagons to America under premium branding. Volvo's V90 Cross Country, Audi's A6 Avant, BMW's 5 Series Touring, Mercedes' E-Class Estate. These vehicles sell in small but stable numbers to buyers who have specifically sought them out, who went looking for exactly what a wagon offers, and weren't deterred by the cultural stigma because their reference point is European rather than American automotive culture. In Europe, the estate body style never accumulated the suburban mom baggage it did here. It remained aspirational. A BMW Touring on German roads carries the same cachet as a BMW sedan. In America, that separation never happened. So let's bring this all the way back to the question that sits underneath everything we've discussed. What did we actually lose, and does it matter? Because there's an argument to be made that we didn't lose anything meaningful, that the market worked exactly as it was supposed to. Consumers wanted something different. Manufacturers provided it. The station wagon was replaced by vehicles that served similar functions while better matching what Americans actually preferred. Evolution, not tragedy. I understand that argument, and I think it's mostly wrong. Here's what the station wagon had that its successors genuinely haven't replicated. It had honesty. There was no pretense in a 1972 Chevrolet Kingswood Estate. It didn't claim to be capable of things it would never be asked to do. It didn't have aggressive styling borrowed from military vehicles or off-road trucks. It didn't sit on a lifted suspension designed to suggest terrain it would never encounter. It was exactly what it was. A very large car built to carry people and their belongings, with a good engine, reasonable comfort, and no apologies for being domestic. That honesty was a feature, not a bug. Here's what most people don't realize about the practicality comparison between a proper full-size wagon and a modern three-row SUV. The wagon usually wins. A 1991 Buick Roadmaster Estate wagon had 64 cubic feet of cargo space with the rear seat folded. A 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe has 94 cubic feet only if you remove the third-row seats entirely and sacrifice seating for 8 passengers. With all 3 rows occupied, the Tahoe gives you 15 cubic feet of cargo space behind the third row. 15. The wagon with all seats in use had more than twice that available in a vehicle that was shorter, lower, and got better fuel economy. The math consistently favors the wagon on utility. The market consistently chose the SUV. That gap between logic and behavior is the story of American consumer culture in miniature. The cultural dimensions are worth examining honestly, too. The station wagon's fall from grace happened to coincide with a particular moment in American self-perception. The shift from the communal optimism of the post-war decades toward a more individualistic, aspirational orientation. The wagon said we're going somewhere together. We need space for all of us and our things. The SUV said I am capable. I am prepared. I command the road. Even if the we was still there, the kids in the back, the dog in the cargo area, the husband in the passenger seat, the message the vehicle projected to the world was individual capability rather than family cohesion. That shift wasn't accidental. It was marketed deliberately and effectively. And it worked because it connected to something real in the culture. Americans in the 1980s and 1990s were in a particular mood. The domesticity of the post-war era felt like constraint rather than comfort. The SUV offered an escape from that, even if the escape was purely imaginary, enacted in parking lots and school pickup lanes rather than mountain passes. Now, you might be thinking, does any of this actually matter for someone buying a car today? And practically speaking, maybe not. The vehicles available now are safer by every measurable standard than anything produced in the wagon's peak years. A modern CR-V will protect its occupants in a collision far better than a 1968 Country Squire. The driver assistance technology, the structural engineering, the passive safety systems, none of it existed in the Golden Age. The nostalgia is real, but the rose tinting should be acknowledged. What matters is understanding how this happened. Because the death of the American station wagon is a case study in how markets can move away from practical, functional solutions toward emotionally resonant ones, and how quickly that shift can happen once the cultural current turns. In 1976, 62 wagon models. In 1996, 0 American-made examples. 20 years from market dominance to extinction. That's fast. Faster than most industries move in any direction. The lesson for anyone thinking about what comes next in automotive culture is this. The crossover's dominance is not guaranteed. The forces that ended the wagon's run, fuel prices, regulatory pressure, cultural shifts, a new product category that reframed the conversation, those forces are still operating. Electric vehicles are changing cost structures and range calculations in ways that reward aerodynamic efficiency. Remote work patterns are changing daily commute distances. Urbanization is making large vehicles increasingly impractical in dense environments. Some combination of factors will eventually pressure the crossover the way oil prices pressured the wagon. The only question is what the alternative will look like, and whether the industry will have the courage to call it something honest. And here's the thing that sticks with me after spending this much time with the station wagon story. The vehicle itself was never really the problem. The wagon worked. It did exactly what it was designed to do, often better than what replaced it. But it became associated with a version of American life that the culture decided it was done with. The wholesome, slightly boring, deeply practical suburban family of the 1950s and 1960s. When that image lost its appeal, the wagon lost its market, regardless of what it actually offered. Look, there's something almost poignant about that. A vehicle that genuinely served American families at the highest level, that carried 3 generations through road trips and grocery runs, and moving days and camping weekends, ultimately abandoned not because it failed, but because the story it told about its owners stopped being the story those owners wanted told. The engineering didn't change, the utility didn't diminish, the image just curdled. If you had a station wagon in your family growing up, the country squire with the peeling vinyl wood grain, the Volvo 240 that ran for 300,000 miles, the Vista Cruiser with the skylight panels that made the back seat feel like you were looking at clouds, you already know something that the market data can't fully capture. You know what it felt like to be in one of those vehicles, on a highway, going somewhere as a family, with the whole American road spread out ahead and nothing particularly urgent except getting there. That feeling didn't go away when the wagons did. It just got harder to find. And maybe that's the most honest thing to say at the end of all this. We didn't just lose a body style in 1996. We lost a particular kind of automotive sincerity. Vehicles that knew exactly what they were, did their job without pretending to be something more, and asked nothing of you except to load up and go. The station wagon is gone. The need it served never went anywhere at all.